On the 1st of March 1954, the United States performed the Castle Bravo nuclear bomb test on an island in the Pacific. The test was much stronger than anticipated, and the island was atomized, engulfed into a mushroom cloud which, within a minute, became 7 miles wide. Dust was spread eastward 300 miles, and atoms from the explosion were spread throughout the world. All that remains where the island used to be is a 75-metre deep crater. 85 miles away, and several hours later, some Japanese fishermen that saw the blast had ash land on their boat. Exposure to this ash irritated their skin. They began to feel sick, and their hair fell out with ease. One of them eventually succumbed to radiation sickness, the first death from a hydrogen bomb. The most famous nuclear explosions are the ones which occurred in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War. But these explosions were merely atom or fission bombs. They relied on splitting atoms. Large unstable atoms are hit with a neutron, a small particle, to split them and release energy. At the Castle Bravo test, this was only the first step in the process, a fusion, hydrogen, or thermonuclear bomb. The splitting of the atom was used to create inward pressure, forcing smaller atoms together to release even more energy. Hydrogen bombs are lighter, faster, cheaper, more efficient, and can produce a larger explosion. The largest atom bomb was 720 kilotons, 48 times stronger than Hiroshima. The largest hydrogen bomb was 50 megatons, 3,000 times stronger than Hiroshima. As a result, the atomic age can be split into two, I would argue, by the Castle Bravo nuclear test. Before Castle Bravo, to quote Winston Churchill, atom bombs, despite their obvious horrors, did not seem unmanageable as an instrument of war. Between plans for evacuation, bomb shelters, and a civil defence corps, early preparations for nuclear war echoed preparations for conventional bombings of World War II. But the hydrogen bomb carries us into dimensions which have never before confronted practical human thought. Nuclear war now caused insurmountable problems with no real solutions. 100 atom bombs on a city would leave survivors. A singular hydrogen bomb would entirely neutralise it. Historian Matthew Grant has referred to the time around the Castle Bravo nuclear test as the thermonuclear moment, the point beyond which nuclear war became synonymous with apocalypse. In order to understand what a nuclear war would look like, first we're going to talk about the damage that one or multiple nuclear explosions can do, to the Earth and to human society. Then, we're going to talk about how it was intended to reduce the potential impact that this would have. The final part of this will focus on Britain, mostly because I'm British and this is my video, but also because Britain was in a unique position. It was the primary target of Soviet aggression for the first 2 to 3 decades of the Cold War, when the US was too far away or impractical to hit. Britain prepared earlier and more thoroughly for nuclear war than did most other nations. We'll be able to see how these early and thorough preparations were to pan out, and ultimately, we'll see that they were probably futile. In 1953, the British government theorised what might happen in the event of nuclear war. They looked at the then worst-case scenario of 200 atom bombs dropped on British cities, 1.4 million dead, 785,000 injured, and 10 million homeless. For this, they had made preparations along the lines of the Blitz. Evacuation, shelters, and a civil defence corps were intended to help people immediately before and after an attack, reducing the death toll and potential injuries. In 1955, a mere 2 years later, a study of 10 hydrogen bombs dropped on Britain's west coast concluded that the death toll would have been 12 million. The difference in scale is inconceivable, and made all other preparations redundant. By the 1980s, Britain would have been bombarded with hundreds of hydrogen bombs, and would have left all major cities as craters. The first threat from nuclear weapons is blast and heat. The initial explosion, which would vaporize buildings and people in an instant, would further away cause buildings to collapse, with people being burned, toppled, or crushed. Survivors would be left with no skin, or would be trapped under debris. After Hiroshima, newspapers reported that no power now on Earth could stand up against such annihilation, and that the destructive capacity of the then atom bomb was beyond visualization. Unsurprisingly, the intense heat of a nuclear blast would cause countless fires, and would also damage electrical wires and gas mains, causing further fires. Individually, these fires would have been manageable, but with many thousands at the same time, fire services, even at full capacity, would be simply overwhelmed. On flat ground, as at Hiroshima and most major cities around the world, the blast would force air out and away from the city. This air would eventually slow down, and then rush back in as warm wind. In minutes, thousands of small, individually manageable flames would become unstoppable, raging firestorms. A US report from 1946 deemed fire to be the most deadly part of the explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and said it's not likely that any firefighting equipment or organisation could have affected any significant reduction in the amount of damage caused by the tremendous conflagration. Securing clean water and food would be immensely difficult. Sewage mains would be damaged, and without a concerted effort to supply clean, bottled drinking water, even those who are unharmed would begin feeling the effects, as their water supply was poisoned. But water supplies would be contaminated anyway. The real danger of nuclear fallout only became apparent to the world after Castle Bravo. As deadly as the explosion and heat are, they are at least visible threats. Fallout is totally invisible, and it contaminates humans, plants, animals, soil, water, and air. Dust and dirt is drawn up into the explosion and is mixed with radioactive elements, becoming enriched by stray particles. All of this then falls out of the sky into nature and causes radiation sickness and cancer. Humans unexposed to fallout, when drinking exposed water, eating exposed food, or breathing exposed air, would then become exposed. Dirt, dust, air, grains, livestock, gathered plants, and hunted animals around the world could all expose humans to harmful levels of radiation for hundreds of years after a nuclear war. And animals and plants around the world would be driven extinct through crippling cancer or infertility. This effect would only be exacerbated by nuclear winter, the release of thousands of weapons worth of dust into the atmosphere, which would block out the sun. For at least a decade, seasons would not behave predictably, affecting plants and consequently animals. This includes agriculture and therefore affects the foundation of our modern world. The damage of widespread nuclear war would be devastating and unmatchable. The damage that it could do within us as humans is, I would argue, more terrifying. I don't mean mutation, I mean socially and culturally. There is a distinct possibility that human society as it has emerged today simply couldn't function after the collective horror of nuclear war, radioactive fallout, and the consequent death, famine, and disease on scales rendering comparison redundant. These factors would totally alter human behaviour, society, and culture. How this affects humans long term can only be the subject of fiction. The book Ridley Walker features a society in the distant future after a nuclear war. The effects of radiation and ecological collapse have physically faded into deep history, but the long shadow of the nuclear war has scarred the human mind. Myths and stories describe poisoned landscapes, mass starvation, and cannibalism. This impacts people's worldviews and stunts them, cementing people into their bleak dystopia. They seek to recreate the old world through superstition and ritual sacrifice. Ideas as concrete and seemingly unchanging to them as our own. In this respect, there may be no undoing the damage of nuclear war. Human psychology, culture, and society would be and would remain forever changed. In 1955, the Strath Report was finished. It was a report into the dangers of the new hydrogen bomb to the British nation. The British state had spent the past decade putting plans into place that would minimise the impact of nuclear war, and the Strath report revealed that, in the face of the new hydrogen bomb, this was worth nothing. A passive defence from 10 hydrogen bombs would require a reorganisation of the entire peacetime economy onto a perpetual total war footing. That is, every part of society should be aiming towards the war effort, all the time. The British government didn't pursue any of the Strath Report's recommendations. It was classified and shelved, only becoming public in 2002. It marks the point beyond which the British government came to a chilling realisation. Nothing substantial could be done to help people in the event of a nuclear war. Plans that were maintained up until then were stripped of funds, left to decay, and were eventually discarded. It was only in 1980 that the plan became clear, with Protect and Survive. An informational campaign that taught people how to prepare for nuclear war, by themselves, without government help. This was a largely futile endeavour. Millions could make the best effort in the world to protect themselves, but their chances of survival were slim to none. Square Leg, a military exercise also held in 1980, estimated that, following 131 nuclear weapons dropped on Britain, 29 million Britons would die instantly. 19 million would survive in the short term, and 7 million would be injured. Protect and Survive was intended to be delivered as a pamphlet to every house in the country and broadcast on the BBC on repeat when a nuclear war was seen as a matter of days away. It included information on the dangers of fallout, the necessity of stockpiling drinking water, food and medicine, and of disposing of the dead. One room, the deepest and lowest in the house, was to be prepared as a fallout room, where survivors would take cover for at least 2 weeks. In their fallout room, a radio and plenty of spare batteries would be their only contact with the wider world. Television broadcasts would be disabled, and all radio masts would broadcast the same frequency, that of the Wartime Broadcasting Service. The WTBS was intended to issue regular updates to survivors. If bombs were dropped, the radio would read a statement confirming that an attack had taken place and would affirm the methods of survival that were to be found in the Protect and Survive pamphlet. This is the beginning and end of that statement.
This is the Wartime Broadcasting Service. This country has been attacked with nuclear weapons. Communications have been severely disrupted, and the number of casualties and the extent of the damage are not yet known. We shall bring you further information as soon as possible. Meanwhile, stay tuned to this wavelength, stay calm, and stay in your own house. We shall be on the air every hour on the hour. Stay tuned to this wavelength, but switch your radios off now to save your batteries. That is the end of this broadcast.
As time progressed, broadcasts would detail the known damage and the trajectory of fallout. After around 2 weeks, when fallout had slowed or stopped entirely, an all clear would be sounded, the point at which people would be able to leave their fallout room. It was to this end that the government put their resources. They began to piece together a system which would enable them to assess and report the damage sustained by nuclear war. The Royal Observer Corps was founded in 1925 to identify planes flying over the country. After the Second World War, when planes got faster than identifying them would make useful, the ROC was co-opted to assist in collating data on bombs and fallout if nuclear war broke out. In the early 1960s, the government planned and built 1,563 Royal Observer Corps posts. These were constructed around the country, approximately 8 miles apart from each other, and were constructed in a standardised fashion. They had a 14-foot deep access shaft with a ladder, and a 9-foot deep subterranean room. In the room, there were 3 beds, storage for food to last at least 2 weeks, tools to monitor blast strength and fallout levels above the ground, tools to communicate with the regional headquarters, and a battery to power it all. There was also a chemical closet, a toilet. When the country was on high alert, 3 people would man a post. And if bombs fell, after the blasts but before the fallout, they would leave their shelter and monitor the ground zero indicator, which would tell them in which direction a blast had occurred, and whether it was an air blast or a ground blast. This would alter the amount of dust carved out of the ground, and therefore the amount of fallout forecasted. They were trained to perform this check quickly, while blindfolded, to reduce the potential exposure to radiation. When the fallout began to fall, they had tools to monitor radiation exposure from within their bunker, where they would stay for as long as they could, logging data and communicating it with their group headquarters. Each ROC post would report to their group headquarter in 31 groups around the country. The data from these posts was to be collated by the United Kingdom Warning and Monitoring Organisation and cross-referenced with weather data from the Met Office to produce a forecast of radioactive fallout. Together, all regional headquarters would collate maps of what Britain now looked like. This is the information that would be broadcast to survivors to inform them of the damage. Survivors would know what to expect then when they left their shelter. They would know what was left of Britain. In 1955, Prime Minister Anthony Eden commissioned a bunker from which the national government could be orchestrated after nuclear war. The Central Government War Headquarters was a national secret at the time. When its existence was leaked in the early 1960s, its location was still unknown. In 1982, it was confirmed to be located underneath Corsham in Wiltshire, a series of limestone caves repurposed into a fallout shelter designed to sustain 4,000 occupants for at least 3 months. These would include selected politicians, scientists, analysts, strategists, clerical staff, technicians, cooks and medics, with the Prime Minister and probably, though it hasn't been confirmed, the royal family. I would argue the role of this bunker was, even before it was finished, minimal. As its name implies, this was a war headquarters. It predates both Protect and Survive and the ROC post system. It was also deliberated for years prior to 1955, so it predates the Strath Report. The supplies in the CGWHQ tell us something as well. It had paper, pens, typewriters, office chairs, a broadcasting studio, and telegraphing tools, which all imply that this bunker was not built for rebuilding after a nuclear war. It was built for fighting an atomic war. The British government had theorised the concept of broken-backed warfare, a long, drawn-out post-nuclear conflict, where an army was incapable of supplying itself, and so was left aiming to totally annihilate the other side. But it became consensus that there would be no fighting after a nuclear exchange. A war involving nuclear weapons would last hours rather than years. I would argue that the CGWHQ was built with this theory in mind. The role of the CGWHQ then becomes unclear. Perhaps it was intended to be the location where central government could take cover and then potentially reassert itself. The journalist Duncan Campbell, writing in 1982, takes a very unkind interpretation. That the CGWHQ was simply to ensure that government officials could protect themselves on the outbreak of nuclear war. Anyway, practically, it was known that the central government and its ability to govern would be seriously impeded for a considerable amount of time, if not permanently. For this reason, the actual plan was to split the UK into regions and govern it at a more local level. In 1957, it was to be governed from regional seats of government. Then, from the 1970s, this system was reorganised to become regional government headquarters, 17 regions and sub-regions. Both of these systems would be headquartered in military or former military sites, and they would be located in distant places. Some plans include remote prisons where prisoners would be released, or bunkers, either purpose-built or repurposed underground stores from World War II, all of which would be perfect for surviving fallout. Authority in these RGHQs was to be in the hands of a select individual, the regional commissioner, who would wield absolute power in their area, and with a full image of the situation in their area, they would use the resources at their disposal to clean up and manage food and other resources effectively. Above all else though, they were to maintain law and order. The dire situation and the tools which they would have at their disposal to do this don't paint a pretty image. They would be in close communication with the military. Police forces also had plans to shelter in their stations. Both would be valuable tools for regional commissioners. There were also to be food stockpiles, meaning that another tool would be the withholding of food. The situation would justify the use of corporal and capital punishment for minor crimes. The months and years after a nuclear war would feature an emaciated, much reduced, exhausted, low morale, mentally and physically scarred public with the threat of state-sanctioned murder looming over their heads for the most minor of transgressions. As the situation worsened further, and no regular, safe food supply would be possible, these authorities would fade and implode. Agriculture, which requires some degree of stability, would give way to hunting and cannibalism. To place Britain into a worldwide context, Europe, Asia, and North America would be decimated in a similar way, with no ability to rebuild. Whether a nation had plans, as Britain did, or not, the end result would mostly be the same. There would be no way to avoid the risks of radiation exposure, and the prioritization of hunting marks a total reversal of anything resembling modern human society. Hence the expression, bombed to the Stone Age. A study, released in December 2022, argued that the survival of human civilization lay in the Southern Hemisphere. Australia and New Zealand would see minimal physical destruction, much less exposure to nuclear fallout, and reduced effects of nuclear winter, thanks to their distance from major targets and lack of population density. They would by no means be unscathed. They might see societal collapse, but they would be the least scathed and best placed to rebuild. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of the plans I've outlined in this video were discarded. The Royal Observer Corps posts, for example, have been either demolished or left to ruin. There are now no serious plans at any level for government survival after nuclear war, but the end result of nuclear war would be the same with or without this thorough preparation. Nations as we know them would fade away. The immediate inheritors of our world would be those that could supply food, and those that could assert their authority. But over time, these groups too would break down, as there would be no way to secure a regular food supply with agriculture. Worldwide, we would regress into nomads, hunter-gatherers, and cannibals by necessity. And humans, thousands of years in the future, would still look upon our ruins as those of a strange and powerful, but lost civilization.